For the absence of a self. So, after analyzing why the 5 aggregates cannot be the self, it becomes quite simple. Anything outside the 5 aggregates also cannot be the self because it has no bearing on our lives. If nothing is the self, if everything is not self, then isn't that precisely what no self means? Therefore, the concept of not self in general encompasses the idea of no self. There's no need to separate or differentiate between the two. This brings us back to the issue of our ingrained thought patterns. This deeply rooted notion of a self is merely a concept. Beyond this concept, you won't find anything that corresponds to it in reality. We cling to the idea that there must be a persistent and changing entity acting as the subject, the agent, the director behind all our actions, thoughts, and experiences. We believe that only then can the world make sense. But this is nothing more than wishful thinking. Our concept of self is just that, a concept. Think about it. This conclusion is quite terrifying. Why? Because all our actions, plans, and efforts revolve around this self. We do everything for this self. Imagine spending your entire life saving every penny, depositing it all into a bank account, dedicating your existence to this account, only to discover that the bank doesn't exist. You can't find it anywhere. Its only existence was in your mind. How terrifying would that be? Absolutely terrifying. Let's recap our discussion of the Brahmanical quest for the self. The Brahmanas believe that where there's a person, there must be a self. Where there's life, there must be a persistent and changing entity behind the scenes, supporting and governing all life's phenomena. Without such an entity, all life would be an illusion, something we perceive as real but ultimately non-existent. These life phenomena would have no owner, no subject. Whose life would it be? Whose experiences? Buddhism, on the other hand, asserts precisely the opposite. There is no such thing as a life subject. Therefore, these life phenomena are indeed illusory. They don't belong to anyone. They simply don't exist in the way we typically assume. There is no self, as evidenced by early Buddhist texts. This means that without a self, there is no person, no human life. Without a self, there is no what belongs to a self, no possessions or experiences to claim as our own. No self implies no self of anything. Therefore, the Brahmanical concept of self and the Buddhist concept of no self are two sides of the same coin, two contradictory propositions. The Brahmanas argue that a person necessitates a self, while Buddhism asserts that it's precisely because there's no self that there's no person. These life phenomena, these 12 links of dependent origination, are presented for us to observe, to understand the causes and conditions from which they arise. But we must remember not to cling to the idea of an owner, a life force, or an agent behind these phenomena. This is the essence of no self. There is no such thing as a who behind it all. At this point, a question naturally arises. Fine, you've argued that a permanent and changing self or life force doesn't exist, and we can't seem to find it. But can there be a changing, impermanent, constantly transforming life? Some might think so, but to entertain this notion is to misunderstand the entire issue. Why do the Brahmanas and philosophers seek a permanent entity behind impermanent phenomena? Because, as we've discussed, it's an inherent human tendency, a cognitive bias we can hardly avoid. We naturally assume that there must be a persistent and changing subject behind all change. Without it, our minds struggle to comprehend the phenomena we experience. Without a permanent self, those life phenomena, our actions, our bodies, our organs might still exist, but they cannot be considered mine or constitute my life. Without the essence of I, there can be no me or my life experiences. Let me illustrate this with an analogy. Imagine seeing a trail of footprints in the ground. These footprints vary in clarity, depth, and shape. It's natural to assume that a pair of feet must have created them. However, upon closer examination and investigation, you discover that no feet could have possibly made these marks. Perhaps someone intentionally pressed them into the ground, or maybe they're just tricks of light and shadow, or naturally occurring formations in the soil. The point is, they are not footprints in the true sense of the word. Now, some might argue, you're just splitting hairs. Fine, I won't call them footprints. I'll just say there are shapes or impressions on the ground. Isn't that acceptable? This is not about semantics. If we're going to say that these impressions on the ground are not footprints, we need to consider their true nature. What is their essence? If we claim they exist, what are the criteria for their existence? What underlies these impressions? You might say it's the soil, but what is soil made of? Molecules, atoms. And what are those made of? And so on. Without delving deeper, we can't definitively say that these impressions on the ground truly exist. This brings us to a fundamental question. Setting aside the concept of a person, can we even say that these phenomena themselves truly exist? To answer this, we need criteria for existence, what constitutes existence and what doesn't. When discussing the person, our criteria were clear. We sought a permanent entity capable of governing all aspects of human life. If found, there's a person; if not, there isn't. Similarly, if we find evidence of feet, the impressions are footprints; if not, they're not. But when examining the existence of these phenomena, these life experiences, what are our criteria? Without criteria, how can we determine whether they exist or not? Early Buddhist texts lack such criteria. There's no standard for judgment, and therefore, no judgment is made. While early Buddhism is clear on the non-self of the person, it remains silent on the nature of the external world, phenomena, and dharmas. We can only speculate on the reasons for this silence. Perhaps the Buddha never addressed it, as some Theravada schools believe. Or maybe he did, but his disciples didn't fully grasp it or transmit it, leaving it to later Mahayana traditions to elaborate on. What we can infer is that the question of Dharma Nirātmya, no self of phenomena, wasn't as pressing in early Buddhism. It wasn't directly relevant to the immediate concerns of practice and liberation. For ordinary beings, the primary concern is suffering and its cessation. By understanding the non-self of the person, suffering can be eradicated. We don't need to eliminate every single condition for liberation. Removing the key link, the illusion of self, is enough to break the chain of suffering and attain arhatship. Therefore, certain questions could be avoided or even suspended, especially if they didn't directly impact the path to liberation. However, as Buddhism evolved and expanded, facing increasing external challenges and scrutiny, it needed to develop a more comprehensive and robust philosophical system. The question of the existence of dharmas could no longer be ignored. About a century after the Buddha's passing, Buddhism diverged into various schools, marking the beginning of the period of early Buddhist schools, followed by the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism. The earlier schools, which continued alongside Mahayana, were labeled Hinayana or lesser vehicle by Mahayana proponents. While these schools shared a consensus on the non-self of the person, they differed in their views on the external world. Some asserted the existence of dharmas, while others downplayed the importance of this question. However, they all agreed that dharmas, or phenomena, are not inherently existent. This became a defining characteristic of what Mahayana Buddhists termed Hinayana. Mahayana Buddhism, on the other hand, with its various sub-schools, coalesced around the concept of Dharma Nirātmya, the emptiness or no self of all phenomena. Whether asserting the existence or non-existence of the external world, a standard of judgment is required. How do we determine what constitutes existence? Despite their opposing conclusions, both Mahayana and the earlier Buddhist schools employed the same criteria when examining the external world. This standard was derived from the Buddha's initial analysis of the self and the nature of life. It involved seeking a permanent and changing entity capable of governing all phenomena, a Dharma self. If such an entity exists, then dharmas exist inherently. If not, then dharmas are empty, lacking inherent existence. The schools that affirm the inherent existence of the external world were labeled Hinayana by Mahayana Buddhists. However, the term Hinayana has since acquired a broader usage. Theravada Buddhists, for instance, reject this label. In academic circles, the term has lost its pejorative connotation and is used mainly for historical categorization. Similarly, the term Veda originally carried a derogatory meaning, implying dog bark. Today, many Hindus prefer alternative translations like wisdom or knowledge. Nevertheless, in scholarly contexts, Veda remains a neutral and widely accepted term.